Ocarina of Time changed the world of gaming. Everyone loved it, and it was the most popular Zelda game ever released. But after that, Nintendo had to bring out a new game that would have to live up to the hype. And so we ended up with Majora's Mask, a strange game that was completely different. So how did we end up with this enigma of a game? Well, let's look into specifically its development, marketing, launch, and more. Let's go! Development. Now our story starts in 1998, right after Ocarina of Time released and became a worldwide hit. Series producer Shigeru Miyamoto wanted to both capitalize on its success and further utilize the game's engine. And so they wanted to make a sequel that would also use a brand new piece of tech that Nintendo had been working on for ages at that point. The original plan was to create a remixed version of Ocarina of Time that would use the 64DD peripheral. This was a magnetic floppy disk drive that only ended up launching in Japan, and originally they wanted to launch this thing sooner, but in the end it took much longer than expected. Now the story for this remixed Ocarina of Time would remain the same, but almost everything else would be different. The overworld would be flipped, enemies would be harder, and dungeons would be relocated and redesigned. In many ways, it would be similar to the second quest mode unlocked after completing the original Legend of Zelda. Now, Aonuma, who had been in charge of dungeons for Ocarina of Time, was once again called to work on this new version. But quite quickly, he became annoyed with it all. He thought that the dungeons from Ocarina of Time were already perfect. So he started designing new dungeon concepts instead of remixing his old work, which he enjoyed a lot. And so he decided to do something quite risky. He was going to confront Shigeru Miyamoto to ask him one thing: can I make a brand new Zelda game instead? Now, Ocarina of Time took 5 years of development, but its sequel didn't receive this luxury. When Aonuma told Miyamoto about his idea, he agreed, but the game had to be finished within a year. Now, he was allowed to use the engine, assets, models, and unused materials of Ocarina of Time as a way to speed up production, but this title would need all new dungeons, story elements, and quests, as well as some fresh mechanics never seen before in the series. Now, Aonuma accepted this challenge, but he was a bit nervous about it all. This was gonna be a race against time, and the clock started ticking right away. The game was developed by a team led by Aonuma himself, Yoshiaki Koizumi, who worked on a number of Zelda titles like A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening and Ocarina of Time, and Shigeru Miyamoto, the original creator of the series, but he only had a supervisory role. Development started in January 1999, just 2 months after Ocarina of Time's release, with a much smaller team under the working title of Zelda Gaiden, which means side story in Japanese. Now the dev team was in for a real challenge. Sure, they could reuse stuff from Ocarina of Time, which saved a lot of time, but it was a very tight deadline, and Zelda fans were expecting a lot from the newest title. Ocarina of Time was a masterpiece after all, so the development team grappled with the question of what kind of game would follow in the wake of Ocarina of Time's success. Well, one thing that influenced development was a repeatable cops and robbers game that Koizumi was working on that would allow players to have a different experience each time they played it, and the aim was to catch a criminal in under a week. This is where the whole idea of the cycle and time travel came from, together with the 1998 film Run Lola Run. This also inspired them, especially Aonuma. In this movie, a woman named Lola races through the streets of Berlin to come up with 100,000 Deutsche Marks in 20 minutes to save her boyfriend's life. When Lola is shot and killed in the process, she unexplicitly gets another shot at it, starting the clock over with 20 minutes to save Manny, and she remembers enough of her last attempt to try a new tactic. When her second attempt gets her boyfriend killed, she gets a third and final shot at it. And this whole concept is similar in many ways to the cycle scene in Majora's Mask. But there are also interviews out there where they say that they only saw the movie once the game was already in development and had this cycle. So yeah, I'm not sure how much the movie influenced the game. Now apparently Koizumi agreed to work with Aonuma on this Zelda title as long as the passage of time was a key element. Now as we all know, Ocarina of Time already had a day and night cycle, but it played a rather small role in the game. But the foundations were already in place, so this was another big time saver. Now originally they wanted to go for a 7-day cycle, and remnants of this are still in the game. The 0-day glitch is a great example of this. Look how far away the moon is. It is all the way up there because due to this glitch, it loads a version of Termina that they used to work on. But in the end, they cut the cycle down to 3 days because they thought that 7 days would be too much to handle for players. You have to keep a lot of things in mind for certain complex side quests after all, like the one involving Cafe and Anju. Now with this 3-day cycle, they could still mess around with the looping mechanic of the same thing happening each day, while the player uncovers more secrets and parts of the world over time. And Miyamoto approved of the concept, liking how it added replayability as well as depth to such a small world. And by using the concepts of time travel as well as a parallel universe, which were new to the series by that time, they could easily make a new world. Koizumi would build a bustling town, focusing on realistic depictions of the lives of the townspeople, all busy going about their day, while Aonuma would design the overworld, with each cardinal direction given a different theme that tied into its dungeons and populated with different races and creatures. And Miyamoto and Koizumi came up with the story that served as the basis for the script written by this guy. Again, I don't like pronouncing Japanese names. Koizumi even said that the idea for the falling moon came from one of his dreams, and the well-known Deku scene at the beginning of the game came from a nightmare that Aonuma had. In general, the aggressive development schedule resulted in a great deal of stress, as well as insanely long working hours. And so many of the writers and developers expressed their frustration by inserting complaints about overwork into the script, as well as the nightmares that they suffered during that time. The whole game in essence is a time crunch, just like the development of the game. Overall, this title had a much more serious tone than many other Zelda games. Sure, Ocarina of Time was a classic medieval-themed hero's journey, but Majora's Mask was a lot more intense. Aonuma felt that players of Ocarina of Time had grown up somewhat, and could be motivated by different emotions like sadness and regret. This is why the game's signature side quest, the Anju and Cafe wedding quest, was intended to highlight the contrast between a joyous occasion and the impending doom. Overall, the game is a lot more depressing, and Koizumi even said that Ocarina of Time's Hyrule was inspired by medieval Europe, while Majora's Mask's Termina took inspiration from Southeast Asia. But some of the ideas that ended up in the game weren't that complex. An art director going by this name, for example, said that the name Majora was a portmanteau of his own surname and Jura from one of his favorite films, Jurassic Park. Now, one other thing they struggled with, aside from coming up with ideas and the time crunch, was the limitations of the N64. They needed some extra juice. Originally, they wanted to release it on the 64DD after all, and so Majora's Mask runs an upgraded version of the engine used in Ocarina of Time and requires the use of Nintendo 64's 4MB expansion pack, making it and Donkey Kong 64 the only two games that require the peripheral. Now, IGN theorized that this requirement is due to Majora's Mask's origin as a Nintendo 64DD game, which would necessitate an extra 4MB of RAM. The use of the expansion pack allows for greater draw distances, more accurate dynamic lighting, more detailed texture mapping and animation, complex frame buffer effects such as motion blur, and more characters displayed on screen. This expanded draw distance allows the player to see much farther and eliminates the need for the fog effect and cardboard panoramas seen in Ocarina of Time, which were used to obscure distant areas. So in many ways, Majora's Mask is one of the best looking games on the N64, and we have this weird little brick filled with 4 megabytes of working memory to thank for it. Now, with the game being almost complete, there was one thing left to cover: the music. It was written by longtime series composer Koji Kondo with contributions from this guy, and the soundtrack largely consists of reworked music from Ocarina of Time, complemented with other traditional Zelda music, such as the overworld theme and new material. Kondo described the music as having an exotic Chinese opera sound, which is especially apparent if you listen to a track like the Happy Mask Salesman song. Here, just listen to the song in game, and an example of Chinese opera back to back. And And so, after 15 months, which is slightly longer than the 1 year they had, Majora's Mask was finished. A dark and sinister masterpiece that was ready to surprise loyal Zelda fans with an interesting new adventure that was very different from the one that came before. But how do you market such a game? Well, they had an interesting approach. Marketing. Alright, as we could have expected, the marketing campaign for this game was quite weird, and in many ways it kinda reminded me of what the Blair Witch Project did. That horror movie was made by students with basically no budget, but it leveraged two things to turn it into a massive success: a mystery and the internet. Back then this was super effective because the internet was brand new, and it was difficult to figure out what was real and what wasn't. Really, that movie was one of the first examples of something going viral on the internet, and in many ways Nintendo tried to do a similar thing with Majora's Mask. And this marketing campaign was called Z Science and Radio Zelda. Now these were two websites. The first one that popped up was Z Science, which was run by a community of scientists known as JRAMOA, which stood for this, and they made two concerning discoveries. There was a parallel universe similar to Earth, and its moon was gonna crash into it. But it got worse. Apparently, if the moon were to destroy that alternative Earth, it would happen to all of us as well. Now, the second website, RadioZelda.com, published audio recordings and videos of that other Earth, and by working together, these two websites found a solution. A hero known as the One had to be found and defeat Majora's Mask before it was too late. And the team over at Z Science used complex DNA sequencing to find this one hero. Meanwhile, Radio Zelda kept the public up to date on the situation. In the end, the person who was the One was Bryce Wilson. No, not that one. This one! He was even shown off in advertisements playing the game. It was one huge mystery filled with Nintendo-related Easter eggs, and all meant to create hype around the upcoming Zelda game, Majora's Mask. If you look, you will find a lot of advertisements related to this long-forgotten campaign, and all of them are weird as well as incredibly cryptic. Now, as soon as the game was shown off to the public at events like the Nintendo Space World exhibition of August 27th, 1999, advertisements became a bit more normal. But still, many of these other advertisements are very weird, like this Japanese commercial where the moon is about to destroy the world while this guy tries to beat the game. Meanwhile, the entire apartment is falling apart, and in this other commercial, he's being stalked by Majora while playing the game, almost haunting him. Overall, these were pretty crazy, and similar advertisements were also shown in other countries. Now, as you can imagine, this marketing campaign was quite, unorthodox compared to Ocarina of Time, but hey, it was fitting for both the game and time period. And they also made more basic advertisements, which just described the game. So, not all of them were beyond bonkers. However, was it successful at all? What happened when the game finally launched? Well, let's look into it. The launch. The game was released in 2000, and surprisingly enough, it did incredibly well. In Japan, they sold more than 600,000 copies by the end of 2000. Meanwhile, in the United States, it was the fourth best-selling game of 2000, at 1.2 million copies. And in Europe, it was the eighth highest-grossing game of 2000. Overall, 3.36 million copies were sold worldwide for the Nintendo 64. But in the end, it was nothing compared to Ocarina of Time. But still, it was the 12th best-selling game for the console, so in the end, it did really well, especially for the time and resources it took. And just like Ocarina of Time, most people loved the game. The game has a crazy score of 95 out of 100 from reviewers and 91 out of 100 from normal users. Many people loved the concept of the 3-day cycle, the depth that most characters and side quests had, as well as the dark setting that was quite unique compared to other Zelda titles. Some reviewers back in the day even called it the oddest rarest, darkest, and saddest of all Zelda games. It was even a runner-up for GameSpot's Best Nintendo 64 Game Award, but sadly enough it lost to another great title, Perfect Dark. And during the 4th annual Interactive Achievement Awards, Majora's Mask was honored with the Console Action Adventure and Game Design Awards. It even received nominations for Console Game of the Year and Game of the Year. So while the game was made in only 15 months and had to indirectly compete with Ocarina of Time, it was able to stand on its own. But as you can imagine, some people didn't like it. Especially the focus on side quests as well as the time crunch was criticized by some. I can remember talking about the game once with Commonwealth Realm, and he also wasn't a fan of the 3-day cycle. It made him very nervous and stressed out while playing it, and not in a good way. So yeah, it isn't for everyone, which I understand, because it's very different from almost any other Zelda title out there, even later ones. But what do I think of the game? Well, my personal opinion. I was first introduced to the game during the GameCube era, because while I did play games on consoles like the SNES and N64, I never owned one. My parents just got me a Game Boy, and later on a GameCube, which was the first home console I ever owned, together with the OG Xbox. Now of course Majora's Mask was never released on the GameCube. It was an N64 game after all, and Virtual Console wasn't a thing yet. But then, I stumbled on a very special promotional disc that a friend of mine received when he bought Mario Kart Double Dash, The Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition. On it, there's a compilation of several Zelda games featuring both games released on the NES and Nintendo 64, a demo for the Wind Waker, and various promotional videos. Here in Europe, the game was initially part of the Nintendo GameCube Mario Kart Double Dash Limited Edition pack, a bundle which includes a GameCube, controller, and Mario Kart Double Dash. Now, when I first booted up the game with that friend of mine, we jumped into Ocarina of Time, but quite quickly he became terrified of the Skulltulas found in the Great Deku Tree, and so in the end I asked him if I could keep it, and since he was incredibly scared of those spiders, he agreed almost immediately. Now I wasn't really scared, I was actually intrigued by it. This was the first time I actually played a Zelda game, and so I gave Ocarina of Time a shot. I remember loving it, but in the end I never beat it. I was too young and didn't speak any English, so I was quite lost to say the least. The same actually happened when I started playing Majora's Mask. I remember running around and exploring Clock Town over and over and over, but I was never really able to get anywhere. As far as I can remember, I was able to get out of Clock Town by turning back time, but that was about it. However, its dark and weird setting captivated me. I loved it, even though I wasn't really sure what was going on. Now around 2 years later, when I was about 12, I got my hands on Twilight Princess for the GameCube, and this was the first Zelda title that I actually beat. So with that victory under my belt, I decided to tackle the 2 other Zelda games that I had played before, but could never conquer: Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Now 2 things I loved and remembered well from my first playthrough were the dark and mysterious theme that the game had, and the massive role music played in the game, especially the Song of Healing. The music really hit me on a deeper level, but the thing that stuck the most, even years later, when I started making videos on this channel, was the dark setting of the game and many mysteries found in Termina. There's a reason why I made so many Majora's Mask theories back in 2016 and 17. To be honest, most of the videos I made covered Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and Twilight Princess. Now, even years later, I still love the dark and weird setting of Majora's Mask. Out of all the Zelda games, this is still my favorite one for that reason. And there's one other thing that Majora does that really works for me. It constantly throws new things at you. What I noticed with video games is that I often get bored. Just following a main quest becomes dull at some point, unless it really captivates me. But in Majora's Mask, there are dozens of side quests, mini dungeons, grottos, and more, which kept me busy for hours. As soon as I got bored of something, I moved on to a different thing. This This is one of the reasons why I replayed this game more than 6 times. And these side quests also have amazing stories with loads of depth, and many of them are connected to others, like the love triangle between Kremya, Anju and Cafe, or the shady deals that the mayor has done with the owner of the curiosity shop. Really, Majora's Mask is a perfect example of less is more, which is something I've been missing in the more recent Zelda titles. Miyamoto and Aonuma already mentioned this during development. A small world with a 3-day cycle can offer immense amounts of depth. And I bet that the crazy deadline actually helped. They had to work fast, so there was barely any time to question ideas and emotions that were bleeding into the game. Sure, it's not good to treat employees like this, but you can't deny that stuff like pain, suffering and stress can be great when making art. In many ways, Majora's Mask is a beautiful tragedy, and I love it forever because of that reason. Thank you all so much for watching. This was basically my Majora's Mask love letter. Again, if you ever have any suggestions for video stuff, leave it in the comments, because I'm kind of, I don't know, I'm just making videos what I feel like. And also because I've done myth busting to death and I'm kind of done with it. So yeah, leave any ideas below, and I love you all. Many kisses. Goodbye.